Mark, a young man who's always lived a life of luxury in New York City until his father, tired of his reckless ways, gives him a shocking ultimatum. Marry a woman he's never met and live on her struggling farm, or lose his wealth forever. Mark is exiled to a remote farm in Kansas, where he meets Sarah, a tough, independent farmer with no patience for his entitled attitude. At first, the arrangement seems unbearable, but as Mark takes on the grueling work of farm life and starts seeing the world through Sarah's eyes, something begins to shift. Mark finds himself facing hard truths, deep betrayals, and choices that could change his life forever. Will he return to his comfortable life in the city, or will he embrace this new, challenging life with Sarah? Stick around to find out. If you're ready for a story of transformation, resilience, and unexpected love, don't forget to hit subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment down below. Let us know what you'd choose if you were in Mark's shoes. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into the story. The heavy silence in Evan Clark's office was as thick as the polished mahogany desk that separated father from son. Evan's steel-gray eyes fixed on his son, Mark, who sat across from him, trying to avoid his father's glare. The walls around them bore framed awards, degrees, and certificates testaments to the wealth and influence Evan had built from the ground up. Behind the desk, a massive floor-to-ceiling window offered a sweeping view of New York's skyline, with sunlight glinting off the towering buildings below. But Mark wasn't interested in the view. His father's gaze held a gravity that made the air feel stifling. "I'm done with your games, Mark." Evan's voice, hard and unyielding, cut through the silence. "Your parties, the endless stream of women, the money you burn through like it's nothing, it ends now." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had heard these lectures before, but this time there was an edge to his father's tone he hadn't heard. This time felt final. "Dad, you're exaggerating," Mark muttered, attempting a casual shrug to deflect the unease building in his chest. "I'm not exactly the first guy to have a little fun with his money. Besides, it's not like it's affecting you." Evan's lips twisted into a cold, humorless smile. "Oh, you think I'm exaggerating? You think I'm just going to stand by and watch you run your life into the ground?" Mark scoffed, crossing his arms defiantly. "So, what's your big plan? You're going to cut me off? I'm an adult, Dad. I can make my own choices." "Oh, you're going to make some choices," Evan replied, leaning forward across the desk, his voice lowering. "I've decided to give you one last chance, Mark, but it's going to be on my terms, not yours." Mark raised an eyebrow, wary but intrigued. "And what exactly does that mean?" "You're getting married," Evan said, his voice brooking no argument. "And you're going to live with her. On her farm." The words hit Mark like a slap across the face. "Marry? Live on a farm?" The disbelief bubbled up inside him, followed by laughter he could barely contain. "You're kidding, right? A farm? And who exactly am I supposed to be marrying?" Evan's expression didn't waver. "Her name is Sarah Wacth. She's a farmer in Kansas, runs a property left to her by her late father. You'll live there, work there, and learn what it means to build something real. It's about time you understood the value of hard work." Mark's laughter died in his throat as he took in his father's unflinching gaze. "This is insane," he said, shaking his head. "You think forcing me to marry some random farmer is going to fix me?" "You don't have a choice," Evan replied, his tone as cold as ever. "Either you go through with this, or I cut you off. No more trust fund, no more endless credit cards, and no more handouts. You want to prove you're an adult? Then it's time you face the real world." Mark stared at his father, stunned. He felt his anger rise, his fists clenching at his sides. "And what about her? Did you tell her she was getting a spoiled, useless city boy as a husband?" Evan's expression remained impassive. "She's aware of the arrangement. It was her suggestion, actually. Her farm is struggling, and she needs the financial security. You'll be helping each other." The room fell into silence, the reality of his father's ultimatum settling over Mark like a suffocating weight. The choice was simple. Either accept the marriage and the life his father had mapped out for him, or lose everything he'd ever known. 2 days, Evan said, breaking the silence. "You leave in 2 days. I suggest you get your affairs in order." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. He could only sit there, staring down at the polished wood of his father's desk, his mind reeling as his father's footsteps echoed out of the office, leaving him alone to grapple with the wreckage of his life. 2 days later, Mark found himself standing at the foot of a long, dusty gravel road in the middle of nowhere. Kansas stretched out before him in vast swaths of open fields, with the farmhouse barely visible in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of earth and grass, so different from the polished, sanitized world he was used to in New York. Clutching his suitcase, he took in the surroundings with a mix of disbelief and resentment. His once impeccable city shoes were already dusted with dirt, and his suit felt oppressively out of place in the rustic landscape. The farmhouse itself was modest, a white, 2-story structure with chipped paint and a wraparound porch that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat in years. There was a strange charm to the place, but to Mark, it looked like a prison. As he approached the house, the front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. Mark stopped in his tracks, momentarily taken aback. Sarah West was not what he had expected. She wore faded jeans and a simple plaid shirt, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face was serious, unsmiling, and there was a quiet strength in her stance, as if the land itself had shaped her. She eyed him with a look that was more skeptical than welcoming. "You must be Mark Clark," she said, her tone flat. Mark swallowed, attempting to maintain some semblance of composure. "Yeah, that's me." He dropped his suitcase onto the porch with a loud thud, the sound echoing in the quiet air. Sarah's eyes flicked down to the suitcase, her expression unchanging. "I didn't ask for this," she said, crossing her arms. "I didn't want it." Mark raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by her bluntness. He had assumed she'd be eager for this arrangement, a ticket to financial stability, a way out of her rural isolation. But her words were as dismissive as his own feelings. "That makes 2 of us," he replied, his voice dripping with bitterness. "I didn't exactly sign up for this either." Sarah nodded slightly, but her expression remained impassive. "Well, you're here now. Might as well get on with it." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. Mark hesitated, staring after her, feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness. This woman clearly wanted nothing to do with him, and yet here he was, forced into her world with no way out. With a resigned sigh, he picked up his suitcase and followed her inside, the reality of his new life settling over him like a lead weight. The interior of the farmhouse was small but clean, with worn furniture and little touches of personality that hinted at the life Sarah had built here. There were framed photographs on the walls, mostly of people Mark didn't recognize, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. "Your room's down the hall," Sarah called over her shoulder, not bothering to look back. "You can get settled in, then I'll show you around." Mark dragged his suitcase along the wooden floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. He found his room at the end of the hall, a small, sparsely furnished space with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out over the endless fields. Dropping his suitcase on the bed, he took in the room with a sinking feeling. The walls were bare, the furniture plain and functional. It was a far cry from the luxurious apartments he was used to, but he had no choice. This was his life now. He let out a frustrated sigh and sat down on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. This place felt like a prison, a stark, unadorned reminder of his father's control over his life. And Sarah, well, she didn't seem interested in making his stay any easier. After a few minutes, he rejoined Sarah in the kitchen, where she was standing by the sink, looking out the window. She didn't acknowledge him when he entered, and the silence between them was heavy. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "Are we supposed to pretend to be married? Play house on this little farm of yours?" Sarah turned to face him, her expression unchanging. "We don't have to pretend anything, Mark. This is real, whether we like it or not." Her words stung more than he wanted to admit. There was something about the way she said it so matter-of-fact, as if she had already come to terms with this arrangement while he was still struggling to believe it was happening. The next morning, Mark was jolted awake by a loud knocking on his door. He groaned, rolling over to check the clock on the bedside table. It wasn't even dawn. "Time to get up," Sarah's voice called from the other side of the door, as brisk and unyielding as a drill sergeant's. There's work to be done. Mark rubbed his eyes, the weight of exhaustion settling over him. In New York, his mornings were leisurely affairs, often beginning well after 10. He didn't move at first, hoping Sarah might give up and let him sleep, but her footsteps echoed down the hall, fading as she left him to his own devices. He had a feeling she wouldn't be so lenient again. Reluctantly, he dragged himself out of bed, pulling on the clothes he'd worn the day before. Everything felt stale and out of place, his clothes too polished for the rustic life he had found himself in. When he finally made his way outside, the first light of dawn was just beginning to creep over the fields, casting a soft glow on the farmhouse. Sarah was already at work, her sleeves rolled up as she moved through the barn, pouring feed into troughs and tending to the animals. She didn't look up when Mark approached, but she did toss a shovel in his direction. "You can start by mucking out the stalls," she said, her tone matter of fact. "It's dirty work, but it needs to be done." Mark looked down at the shovel, his face twisting in distaste. "Mucking out what?" She finally looked up, her gaze cool and steady. "The stalls, Mark. You shovel out the manure, replace the straw, and make sure the animals have a clean space to stay in." His stomach churned at the thought. This wasn't just manual labor. This was the kind of dirty, back-breaking work he had always believed was beneath him. He let out a sigh of frustration, muttering under his breath. But when he looked up, he found Sarah's gaze unwavering. "You're not in New York anymore," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Things are different here. We all do our part." Mark hesitated, feeling a wave of resentment rise within him. He hadn't chosen this life, he had been forced into it. But he could see from the set of her jaw that there was no use arguing. She wasn't going to give him any sympathy, and he wasn't about to ask for it. With a resigned sigh, he grabbed the shovel and made his way into the first stall, trying to ignore the pungent smell that filled the air. Every movement felt awkward and unnatural, the shovel heavy in his hands. He was sweating within minutes, his muscles straining with each scoop of straw and manure. The hours dragged on, each one more grueling than the last. By the time he finished the last stall, his back was aching, and his hands were blistered from gripping the shovel. He leaned against the barn wall, panting as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She looked at the stalls he'd cleaned, nodding slightly. "Not bad," she said, her tone neutral. "But you're not done yet. The animals need fresh water, and the fences need checking. Farm work doesn't care how tired you are, it cares about getting done." Mark scowled, too exhausted to even muster a response. But as he picked himself up and followed her instructions, a realization began to settle over him. This life, this work, it was real in a way he'd never experienced before. There were no shortcuts, no easy solutions. For the first time, he was beginning to understand what his father had meant when he'd said Mark needed to learn the value of hard work. The days blurred together as Mark struggled to keep up with the demands of farm life. Each morning began before dawn, with chores that seemed endless: feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, repairing fences, and hauling supplies across the property. By the time the sun set, he was too exhausted to even think about anything beyond getting to bed. But amid the hard work and exhaustion, there were moments of quiet that brought a strange sense of peace. Sometimes, as he worked in the fields or tended to the animals, he'd find himself pausing, listening to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees or the soft clucking of the chickens in their coop. It was a kind of stillness he had never experienced in the city, where the noise and chaos were constant. In those moments, he'd glance over at Sarah, who worked with a quiet determination that seemed almost effortless. She moved through each task with a sense of purpose, her face set in a calm, focused expression. He began to see her differently, not as the cold, distant woman he'd first met, but as someone who had built a life for herself, no matter how difficult it had been. One evening, after a particularly long day, they found themselves sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was streaked with shades of pink and orange, casting a warm glow over the fields. Sarah glanced over at him, her expression softening just a bit. "You're getting the hang of it," she said, almost as if she were surprised. Mark gave a tired smile, shrugging. I still feel like I'm fumbling through most of it. She nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Farm work isn't something you master overnight. It takes time. They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For the first time since he'd arrived, Mark felt a strange sense of belonging. It wasn't the glamorous life he had once envisioned for himself, but there was something grounding about it, something that felt real. The peace didn't last long. A few days later, dark clouds began to gather over the horizon, casting an ominous shadow over the fields. Sarah was out checking the fences when the first drops of rain began to fall, and Mark rushed to help her secure the barn doors and round up the animals. The storm hit with a fury he hadn't anticipated. Thunder rumbled overhead, and sheets of rain pelted down, turning the ground to mud. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the farmhouse and sending a chill down his spine. "Get the animals inside," Sarah shouted over the roar of the storm as she dashed toward the barn, her hair whipping around her face. Mark followed her, his feet sinking into the mud as he struggled to keep up. Inside the barn, the animals whinnied and brayed, their eyes wide with fear. Mark and Sarah worked quickly, securing the doors and calming the animals as best they could. The wind was relentless, rattling the walls and making everything feel as if it could come crashing down at any moment. "Are they all in?" Mark asked, breathless as he wiped the rain from his face. Sarah nodded, her face tense. "We need to check the fences. If they come down, the animals could get out." Without hesitation, they raced back out into the storm, their clothes soaked through as they made their way to the edge of the property where the fence line stretched. Mark could barely see a few feet in front of him, the rain coming down in torrents that made everything a blur. They reached the fence just as part of it began to lean dangerously, the wind threatening to tear it apart. Mark grabbed a hammer and nails from the nearby shed, his hands trembling as he worked to secure the fence. Every movement felt like a battle, the wind and rain pushing against him, but he forced himself to keep going, knowing the animal's safety depended on it. Sarah worked beside him, her hands moving quickly and efficiently despite the conditions. They didn't speak, just focused on the task at hand, each second feeling like a race against the storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to secure the last section of the fence. They stood there, panting and drenched, but the fence held steady, and the animals were safe for now. Mark glanced over at Sarah, who was wiping the mud and rain from her face. There was a fire in her eyes, a resilience he couldn't help but admire. She caught his gaze and gave him a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of the work they had done together. "Let's get back inside," she said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "We're no good to the farm if we're both sick tomorrows." They made their way back to the farmhouse, the storm still raging outside. Inside, the warmth of the house felt almost surreal after the chaos they had just endured. They stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the floor, both of them too tired to speak. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "For helping." Mark shrugged, still catching his breath. "I didn't really have a choice, did I?" For the first time, Sarah gave him a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make something inside him shift a slow, creeping sense that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand what his father had meant when he'd sent him here. That night, as the storm continued to batter the farmhouse, Mark lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but there was something else, too, an unfamiliar sense of satisfaction, of having accomplished something real. He had spent so much of his life floating through a world of comfort and ease, never having to push himself, never having to face anything beyond his own shallow desires. But here, in this small farmhouse in the middle of Kansas, he had been forced to confront his own weaknesses, his own limitations. And for the first time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. As he drifted off to sleep, the memory of Sarah's brief smile lingered in his mind, a small but significant reminder that maybe he was starting to find his place here, even if he hadn't meant to. Days turned into weeks, and Mark settled, if reluctantly, into the grueling rhythm of life on the farm. Each morning began before dawn, with chores that felt endless and sometimes impossible. Sarah was a demanding teacher, showing him how to clean the animal stalls, repair fences, and haul supplies across the fields with efficiency. She didn't waste words, nor did she offer praise, and each day was filled with more work than he thought possible. Yet, something within him began to shift. At first, he resisted, feeling like a stranger in his own life. But as he watched Sarah move with calm, steady purpose, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for her. This life was her legacy, something she had chosen and fought for. And against his own instincts, he found himself trying to match her strength. They worked side by side in the fields, often in silence. But there were moments when he caught her looking at him, a flicker of curiosity in her gaze. He wondered what she thought of him, if she saw him as a nuisance, or if she, too, was beginning to sense that perhaps they weren't as different as they both had assumed. One afternoon, as they planted seeds in the field, Mark dared to break the silence. "How did you end up here, doing all of this on your own?" Sarah didn't look up from her work, her hands moving in the soil with practiced ease. "My father passed away a few years ago," she replied, her voice steady but distant. "Left the farm to me, and I couldn't just let it go. This place is all I have." Mark nodded, her words lingering in his mind. She had held on to the farm with everything she had, facing the challenges alone, without anyone to lean on. He couldn't imagine that kind of determination, but he found himself wanting to understand it. "You could have left," he said, his voice softer. "Started somewhere new." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe, but some things are worth fighting for." He didn't know how to respond, but her words left a mark on him. For the first time, he wondered if he could ever care about something enough to fight for it the way she had. As the weeks passed, Mark's body adjusted to the demands of farm labor, and he found himself growing stronger, both physically and mentally. The soreness that once left him exhausted at the end of each day became more bearable, and he noticed small changes. His hands, once smooth and uncalloused, were now rough and sturdy. His shoulders, once unused to heavy lifting, had developed a quiet strength. But it wasn't just his body that was changing. His perspective on Sarah and on the farm was shifting too. He began to see the quiet beauty in the early mornings when the fields stretched out in a misty glow, and the satisfaction in each completed chore, no matter how small. One evening, after a long day spent repairing a broken fence, he found Sarah sitting on the porch, looking out over the fields as the sun set. He joined her, settling down on the steps beside her, the silence between them filled with an unspoken camaraderie. "You did good work today," she said, her voice breaking the quiet. The comment was unexpected, and he felt a small, unfamiliar flicker of pride. "Thanks," he replied, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. "I guess I'm getting the hang of it." She gave a faint smile, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Farm work isn't for everyone, but you're learning." They fell back into silence, but this time, it was a comfortable one. For the first time, Mark felt like he belonged here, not just as an outsider forced into a life he didn't want, but as someone who was starting to understand what it meant to work for something real. Their interactions grew more familiar, each day building a foundation of trust and quiet respect. Mark found himself watching Sarah with new eyes, noticing the small things he had overlooked before, the way her brow furrowed when she was deep in thought, the soft laugh she tried to stifle when something amused her, the strength in her hands as she worked the land with a focus that never wavered. As spring turned into summer, they began to work side by side more often, their conversations becoming more open and relaxed. One evening, as they shared a simple meal on the porch, he found himself laughing at something she said, a genuine laugh, one that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "You're not as bad as I thought," she said, a playful glint in her eyes. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I think that might be the nicest thing you've said to me since I got here." She shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Don't let it go to your head." They shared a quiet smile, and for a moment, the world outside the farm faded away. He realized then that he didn't mind the simplicity of this life. It was far from the high society events and glamorous parties he had once thrived on, but it was real, and that, he was beginning to understand, was worth more than he had ever imagined. The summer brought with it the intense heat and the relentless work of tending to the crops and caring for the animals. But with the heat came another threat, another storm, this one more powerful than the last. Dark clouds rolled over the horizon one humid afternoon, casting a heavy shadow over the fields. Sarah was already outside, her face set in a determined expression as she moved through the barn, securing the doors and making sure the animals were safe. Mark ran to her side, ready to help. "We need to get everything inside," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "This one's going to be rough." The wind picked up, sending a chill down his spine as he glanced toward the darkening sky. He could feel the weight of the storm approaching, the air thick with tension. As the rain began to fall in sheets, they worked side by side, rounding up the animals and bringing them into the barn. Thunder rumbled overhead, and lightning split the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The storm raged, and Mark could feel his heart racing, the adrenaline coursing through him as he fought to keep the animals calm. Just as they finished securing the barn, a loud crack echoed through the air, the sound of wood splintering. They turned to see a large branch from a nearby tree crashing down on a part of the fence, shattering it on impact. "We have to fix it before the animals get out," Sarah shouted over the roar of the storm, her face pale but determined. They ran to the shed, grabbing tools and materials as the rain soaked through their clothes, leaving them drenched and shivering. Mark's hands were shaking as he held the wood in place, struggling to keep steady as Sarah hammered the nails with quick, precise movements. The storm showed no mercy, battering them with wind and rain, but they kept working, each movement a test of their endurance. Hours passed, though it felt like a blur of chaotic noise and frantic effort. Finally, as the storm began to wane, they secured the last section of the fence, both of them drenched and exhausted but triumphant. Mark slumped to the ground, breathing heavily, his body aching from the relentless work. Sarah sat down beside him, her own breaths labored, and for a moment they simply sat in the silence, the only sound the soft patter of rain as it slowed to a gentle drizzle. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. He looked over at her, his own exhaustion mirrored in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me. We did it together." She smiled, a real, warm smile that made something in his chest tighten. He realized then how much she had come to mean to him, not just as a partner in this strange, forced life, but as someone he genuinely admired. They made their way back to the farmhouse, where Sarah started a fire in the small living room to warm them. They sat in silence, the heat from the flames seeping into their bones, the quiet between them no longer heavy with tension, but comfortable and steady. "This life, it's not what I expected," he admitted after a while, staring into the fire. She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "What did you expect?" He shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I don't know, but it wasn't this. I never thought I'd find peace here." They fell into silence again, and as the fire crackled, Mark felt a strange sense of contentment settle over him. The storm had tested them, pushing them to their limits, but it had also brought them closer. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something real, something that mattered. The calm didn't last. A few days later, Mark received a call from his father, Evan. The familiar voice on the other end of the line was as cold and commanding as ever. "Mark, it's time to come home. You've had your little experience. Now, it's time to step back into the real world." Mark's stomach tightened. He hadn't heard from his father since he'd arrived at the farm, and part of him had begun to hope that maybe Evan had moved on, that he would be free to make his own choices. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tense. "I'm offering you a way out," Evan replied smoothly. "Come back to New York, take your place in the company. Leave the farm and the girl." Mark's heart pounded, the words sinking in like a lead weight. He glanced out the window, where Sarah was working in the distance, her figure framed against the open fields. The choice seemed simple. Return to the life he had once wanted so desperately, or stay here, in this strange, hard life he had come to love. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put into words the confusion and conflict swirling within him. "I need to think about it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Evan's silence on the other end of the line was telling. "Don't take too long," he said, his tone sharp. You don't have forever. The call ended, leaving Mark standing in the small farmhouse kitchen, his mind racing. This was his chance to escape, to return to the wealth and comfort he had once cherished. But as he looked out at Sarah, working tirelessly under the sun, he wondered if he could really walk away from this life, and from her. That night, sleep eluded Mark as he lay in the small, familiar bed, his mind racing with his father's ultimatum. The farmhouse was silent, save for the soft rustling of the trees outside and the distant hum of insects. Normally, these sounds brought him peace, a quiet reassurance he hadn't realized he valued. But now they only seemed to amplify the inner turmoil he felt. He thought back to his life in New York, the penthouse apartment, the endless parties, the luxury. It had been a life free from responsibility, where everything he wanted had been handed to him without question. But it was also a life that felt strangely hollow now, like an echo of someone else's dreams. When dawn finally broke, he rose from his bed and made his way outside. The sky was still dark, tinged with the faintest light of morning, and a cool breeze swept across the fields. Sarah was already outside, as she often was, feeding the animals before the day's work began. Couldn't sleep? She asked, her tone casual as she glanced over at him. He shook his head, his mind still heavy with unanswered questions. I needed some fresh air, he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. She gave him a long, assessing look, her eyes sharp. Something on your mind? He hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his own doubts, but the need to share his struggle outweighed his pride. My father called yesterday, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wants you to come back to New York, to leave the farm, and you. Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a sadness, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. She set down the bucket she was holding, crossing her arms as she faced him. So, what are you going to do? The question hung in the air, simple but profound. For once, he didn't have an answer. He had spent his entire life chasing the approval of a man who had never been satisfied, who had always pushed him to be more, to do more. But here, in the quiet fields of Kansas, he had found something different, something he couldn't name, but was reluctant to let go of. I don't know, he admitted, his voice soft. I thought I wanted to go back. But now, I don't know if I can. Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. It's your choice, Mark. No one can make it for you. She turned back to her work, leaving him standing there in the cool morning light, the weight of her words settling over him. It was his choice, and for the first time, he realized that he wanted to choose for himself, not for his father or anyone else. Mark threw himself into the day's work with a renewed determination. He had always approached the farm tasks with a sense of duty, but now he began to see each chore as an opportunity, a chance to prove to himself, and to Sarah, that he belonged here. As the days turned into weeks, he learned to move with confidence, each task becoming second nature. He repaired fences without hesitation, fed the animals without complaint, and even began tending to the crops with a sense of pride. His hands, once soft and untested, were now calloused and strong, bearing the marks of hard work. And with each passing day, his connection to Sarah deepened. They shared quiet meals together, moments of laughter over simple jokes, and conversations that felt more honest than anything he had known in New York. She told him about her father, about the hardships of running the farm alone, and he found himself opening up to her about his own struggles, the loneliness he had masked with parties and wealth, the emptiness he had felt in the life he had once cherished. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, he turned to her, a question lingering on his mind. Why did you agree to this? He asked. The marriage, the arrangement with my father. You didn't seem like someone who'd want that kind of deal. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The farm was in trouble, she said finally, her voice soft. My father left it to me, but I didn't have the money to keep it running. When your father offered, I didn't see another way. Mark felt a pang of guilt, knowing that his father had used both of them, manipulating their circumstances to achieve his own ends. But he also felt a growing admiration for Sarah. She had done what she needed to do, sacrificing her own freedom to save something she loved. I'm sorry, he said, his voice heavy with regret. You deserved better. She gave him a faint smile, a hint of warmth in her eyes. We both did. The next morning, Mark woke before dawn, feeling a strange sense of calm. He slipped out of bed and made his way outside, the cool morning air sharp against his skin. The sky was painted with the soft hues of dawn, and for a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the quiet beauty of the farm. Sarah appeared beside him, her presence as steady and unyielding as the land itself. She looked at him, her expression softer than usual. "You're up early," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. He nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I figured I'd get a head start." They worked side by side that morning, their movements synchronized in a way that felt almost natural. They didn't need to speak. The rhythm of the work, the steady hum of the farm, was enough to fill the silence between them. At one point, as they fed the horses, Sarah handed him a brush. "You're responsible for them now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "They need to be brushed and checked every day." He took the brush, a sense of pride swelling within him. It was a small task, but it was also a sign of her trust, a quiet acknowledgement that he was no longer just a visitor here, he was part of the farm. As he brushed the horses, he felt a strange connection forming, a bond between himself and the land that went beyond duty or obligation. This life, with its simplicity and its challenges, had become something he valued deeply, something he wanted to hold on to. And as he worked, he felt his decision solidifying within him. He knew what he wanted to stay. The moment of truth came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, as he was mending a fence, he saw a familiar black car pull up the driveway, its sleek, polished exterior a stark contrast to the rustic landscape. His heart sank as he recognized the man stepping out of the car, his father, Evan. Evan walked toward him with a purposeful stride, his expression cold and unreadable. Mark straightened, setting down his tools as he braced himself for the confrontation. "So," Evan said, his voice smooth but laced with disappointment, "this is what you've chosen." Mark felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "I've chosen a life that means something, one that's real." Evan's gaze swept over the farm, his lips curling in a sneer. "You think this is real? This farm, this life, it's nothing but a dead end." Mark clenched his fists, the words stinging more than he wanted to admit. "It's more than that. It's something I can build, something I can be proud of." Evan's expression hardened, a flash of anger in his eyes. "You're throwing everything away, Mark. For what? A life of poverty? A woman you barely know?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I know her well enough, and she's worth more than any of the empty promises you offered me in New York." Evan's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "If you walk away from this, you're on your own. No money, no support. You'll be cut off, for good." The words hit like a physical blow, but Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had known this moment would come, had prepared himself for the finality of his decision. And now, standing here in the place he had come to love, he felt a clarity he had never known before. "That's fine," he said quietly, meeting his father's gaze with unwavering resolve. "I don't need your money. Not anymore." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of Mark's words settling between them. Then, without another word, Evan turned and walked back to his car, leaving Mark standing alone in the fading light. Later that evening, Mark found Sarah on the porch, her hands resting in her lap as she gazed out over the fields. The sky was painted with the colors of dusk, the soft glow casting a warm light over the land. He sat down beside her, the familiar creak of the porch boards grounding him. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day hanging heavy in the air. "I told him I'm staying," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm surer of this than I've ever been about anything." A faint smile appeared on her face, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. They sat together, watching the stars begin to dip the night sky, a quiet sense of peace settling over them. For the first time, Mark felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The farm, once a place of exile and punishment, had become his home. And Sarah, The woman he had once seen as a stranger had become someone he wanted to share his future with. They had both faced their own battles, their own struggles, but now they stood on the same ground, ready to build something new together. A few quiet days had passed since Mark told his father he was staying, and in that time, the farm had returned to its steady rhythm. Mark worked the fields with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before, and Sarah seemed to be at ease with him by her side. Their partnership felt natural now, as if they'd been doing this together for years. One late afternoon, as Mark finished mending a fence, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Seeing his father's number, he hesitated but eventually answered, bracing himself for what he knew wouldn't be a friendly call. Mark, his father's familiar, cold voice came through, lacking any warmth or pleasantries. "I thought I'd made myself clear, but if you won't come back, then I think it's time you knew the truth about this little arrangement." Mark's stomach tightened, a feeling of dread settling over him. "What are you talking about?" Evan's voice was calm, almost taunting. "You think she wanted this marriage? That she's some innocent farmer forced into this by me?" "Mark, it was her idea." The words hung in the air, each one landing like a blow. "What are you talking about?" "She approached me first," Evan continued, a smug satisfaction in his tone. "She needed the money to save her precious little farm. She was willing to go to any lengths to keep it. So I agreed on the condition that you'd learn a lesson from this. She proposed the marriage, Mark. All of this, every moment, was just part of a deal." Mark felt his world tilting, his heart pounding as he tried to process the words. He believed his father had orchestrated everything. But this, Sarah, the woman he'd come to trust? It couldn't be true. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mark's voice was barely more than a whisper. Evan chuckled. "Because I want you to understand just how much she's used you. She's no different from the people you've been running away from. But don't say I didn't warn you. I gave you everything, Mark. I handed you the world, and you threw it away for a lie." The line went dead, leaving Mark standing there in stunned silence, the phone still clutched in his hand. The evening sun was sinking behind the fields as Mark made his way back to the farmhouse, his mind a chaotic swirl of anger and confusion. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her movements calm and familiar. But tonight, everything felt wrong. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. She looked up, startled by the edge in his tone. "Tell you what?" "About the deal," he said, his words laced with hurt. "About how you went to my father first. How you proposed this marriage just to save your farm." A flicker of pain crossed her face, but she didn't look away. "It's true," she admitted, her voice steady but soft. "I went to your father. The farm was in trouble, and I didn't have a choice. I didn't think it would be like this." Mark clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "So, it was all just business to you? This marriage, this partnership? Was any of it real?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes filling with regret. "At first, that's all it was. But it changed, Mark. You changed. I didn't expect to feel anything for you. But now, I can't imagine the farm, this life, without you." Her words were sincere, but Mark felt a wave of betrayal wash over him. He had opened himself up to her, had let himself believe that what they were building was genuine. But now, he wasn't sure if any of it was real. "You should have told me the truth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I deserve to know." "I know," she replied, her voice breaking. "But I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you'd leave, and I'd lose you and the farm." They stood in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. He could see the guilt in her eyes, could feel the sincerity in her regret. But the hurt was too deep, the wound too fresh. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the farmhouse, leaving her standing alone in the quiet kitchen. Mark spent the next few days lost in a haze of anger and confusion. He threw himself into the work, hoping the physical labor would drown out the thoughts swirling in his mind. But nothing could erase the pain of betrayal, the feeling of being manipulated by the one person he had come to trust. Sarah kept her distance, giving him space to process everything, though he could feel her presence everywhere he went. The fields, the barn, the farmhouse, they were all filled with memories of her, of the moments they had shared. And as much as he wanted to, he couldn't simply erase those memories. One evening, as he sat alone in the fields, watching the sun set, he found himself questioning everything he had once believed. His father's manipulation, his own choices, and most of all, Sarah's actions. She had lied, yes, but she had also shown him kindness, had given him a chance to find a life he hadn't even known he wanted. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to forgive. Unable to find peace, Mark decided. He needed answers, real answers, not the half-truths and manipulations he had been fed his entire life. And there was only one person who could give them to him. He called his father and arranged a meeting, traveling back to New York for the first time since he had left. The city felt different now, its noise and crowds a stark contrast to the quiet life he had come to value. In his father's office, the same place where this whole ordeal had begun, Mark faced Evan with a newfound sense of purpose. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice steady. "Why go to such lengths to control me?" Evan looked at him with the same cold, calculating gaze he had always worn. "I was trying to save you from yourself, Mark. You were weak, irresponsible, throwing away everything I'd built for you. I thought this would teach you a lesson." Mark clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "And Sarah? You use her just as much as you used me. You manipulated both of us." Evan shrugged, his expression unrepentant. "She was desperate, and I saw an opportunity. It was a business transaction, nothing more." Mark shook his head, disgusted by his father's callousness. "She's a person, Dad, not some pawn in your game." A flicker of frustration crossed Evan's face. "And what do you think you've gained from this little experiment? A life of poverty? A woman who lied to you?" Mark met his father's gaze, his voice calm but resolute. "I gained something you never gave me. Purpose. And I'm choosing to stay with her. Not because of some deal, but because I want to." Evan's face hardened, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Then you're on your own. Don't expect anything from me." Mark felt a strange sense of relief at the words, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't need his father's approval or his money. For the first time, he was free. Mark returned to Kansas, his heart heavy, but his mind clear. The farm felt like home now, a place he had fought for and built with his own hands. And as he approached the farmhouse, he saw Sarah waiting on the porch, her expression a mix of hope and fear. He climbed the steps, stopping in front of her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret and vulnerability. "I know I hurt you," she said quietly, "and I can't take that back. But I need you to know that everything I feel for you, it's real." Mark took a deep breath, the anger and hurt still lingering, but softened by the love he couldn't deny. "I know," he replied, his voice gentle, "and I want to be here, with you. But we need to be honest with each other from now on." She nodded, relief flooding her face as she reached for his hand. They stood together in the soft evening light, the weight of their past mistakes lifted, replaced by a shared commitment to a future built on trust and respect. Over the following weeks, Mark and Sarah worked together to rebuild what had been broken. Their conversations were open, their partnership strengthened by the honesty they had fought to achieve. They made plans for the farm, discussing new crops, potential expansions, and ways to make the land more sustainable. Mark found a deep satisfaction in their work, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own wants and needs. This life, with all its challenges, had given him something real, something he had never found in the hollow luxury of his old world. And Sarah, once distant and guarded, had become his partner in every sense of the word. They were equals, each bringing their own strengths and vulnerabilities to the table, building a future that belonged to both of them. The early days of autumn arrived with a cool, gentle breeze sweeping over the fields, a reminder that a new season was beginning. The farm, which had once felt like a prison to Mark, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where he had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. He and Sarah worked together every day, side by side, but now there was a deeper sense of unity between them. Their trust in each other was hard-earned, built on the foundation of forgiveness and resilience. The farm had become a symbol of that shared strength, a place they had both fought to keep, for reasons that had once seemed worlds apart but now aligned. One afternoon, They sat on the porch after a long day in the fields, each nursing a glass of cold lemonade as they looked out over the land they'd worked so hard to cultivate. The air was filled with the sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the quiet contentment that had become part of their lives. "We've come a long way," Sarah said, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Mark looked over at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You can say that again? I barely recognized the person I was when I first got here." She glanced at him, her eyes warm. "I think I do. You're different, yes, but that drive, that fire was always there. You just needed a place to find it." He thought about her words, feeling a surge of gratitude. She had seen something in him even when he hadn't, and had given him the chance to prove it, not just to her, but to himself. "We make a good team, you know," he said, reaching out to take her hand, his voice steady. "Better than I ever thought we would." Her smile grew, and she laced her fingers through his. "Yeah, we do." In that moment, Mark knew he had found something he would fight for, something that had been missing in his old life of wealth and privilege. This place, this life, and this woman, they were real in a way that went beyond anything he had ever known. As the days turned colder, Mark and Sarah began to prepare the farm for the winter, their routine falling into a comfortable rhythm. They spent hours planning for the next season, mapping out new areas for planting, discussing potential expansions, and brainstorming ideas for making the farm more sustainable. One evening, they sat at the kitchen table, a stack of seed catalogs spread out before them. Sarah was leaning over a notebook, scribbling down notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What if we tried adding a small greenhouse?" Mark suggested, flipping through one of the catalogs. "That way, we could grow fresh vegetables through the winter and maybe even sell some at the local market." Sarah looked up, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "That could work. It'd be an investment, but if we do it right, it could really pay off." Mark felt a thrill of satisfaction at her response. The greenhouse was more than just a project. It was a symbol of the future they were building together. For so long, he had drifted through life, relying on his father's wealth and never needing to put down roots. But now, he found himself thinking about what he wanted this farm to look like in a year, in 5 years, even in 10. They continued to plan late into the night, their heads bent together over the table, their laughter filling the quiet farmhouse. For the first time, Mark felt a true sense of purpose, not just in the work itself, but in the life he was creating with Sarah. As winter set in, the farm was blanketed in a soft layer of snow, transforming the landscape into a serene, white expanse. The days grew shorter, but the work never stopped. There were animals to care for, equipment to maintain, and plans to prepare for the coming spring. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mark looked over at Sarah, who was quietly knitting by the firelight. The soft glow of the flames highlighted the gentleness in her face, a side of her he hadn't often seen amid the demands of farm life. "Thank you," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For giving me a chance," he replied, his voice full of sincerity. "For believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself." She set her knitting aside and moved closer to him, taking his hand in hers. "We've both taken chances, Mark, and it hasn't been easy. But I don't regret a single moment of it." They sat together in the warmth of the fire, their fingers intertwined, a quiet understanding passing between them. The journey they had taken together had been hard, but it had also been worth every challenge, every heartbreak. They had found something rare, a partnership built on honesty, respect, and an unspoken promise to face whatever the future might bring together. As the snow began to melt, a sense of anticipation filled the air. Spring was just around the corner, and with it came the promise of new beginnings. The greenhouse they had built over the winter was ready to be filled with fresh plants, a project they both looked forward to with excitement. One morning, as they stood together in the greenhouse, Sarah handed him a small packet of seeds. "Here," she said, her eyes twinkling with a warmth that made his heart skip a beat. "These are the first seeds of the season. I thought you might want to plant them." Mark took the packet from her, feeling a strange sense of honor at the gesture. He knelt down, pressing his fingers into the cool soil, and carefully planted the seeds, covering them gently with earth. As he worked, he felt Sarah's hand on his shoulder, a comforting presence by his side. They were starting something new together, something that symbolized all the hard work and growth they had shared. When he looked up, their eyes met, and he saw in her gaze a reflection of the hope and love that had carried them through every challenge. They had come full circle, from strangers forced together by circumstance to partners who had chosen each other, who had built something real and lasting. The days stretched into weeks, each one filled with the promise of the future they were building. Mark found a deep sense of fulfillment in the work, the steady rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting bringing him a joy he had never expected. The farm, once a place of exile and punishment, had become his home, a place where he could finally be himself. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, he and Sarah stood by the barn, watching the light fade over the land. He turned to her, his heart full of gratitude and love. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "this is more than I ever thought I'd have, more than I ever thought I'd want." She smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "Me too." They stood there together, hand in hand, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. In that moment, Mark knew with absolute certainty that he had found something far more valuable than any amount of money or power he had once chased in New York. He had found purpose, love, and a life that mattered. As the seasons turned, Mark and Sarah continued to build their life together, each year bringing new challenges and triumphs. They expanded the farm, added more animals, and grew their crops with a dedication that went beyond mere survival. The farm became a thriving part of the community, a place where people gathered, where neighbors helped one another, and where memories were made. Years later, on a warm autumn day, Mark looked out over the fields, watching the harvest being gathered, and felt a profound sense of peace. He had come to this place reluctantly, a man adrift and lost. But now, he was rooted, grounded by the life he had built with Sarah and the love they had nurtured through every hardship. As he walked back to the farmhouse, he found Sarah waiting for him on the porch, her smile as warm and familiar as the land itself. He joined her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they watched the sun sink behind the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields. Together, they had weathered storms, faced betrayal, and overcome doubt. And now, as they stood side by side, they knew that whatever the future held, they were ready to face it together. The farm, once just a piece of land, had become a symbol of their journey, a testament to the resilience of love and the strength of two hearts united by purpose. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, Mark knew, with a certainty he had never known before, that he had finally found his true home. Thank you so much for joining me on Mark and Sarah's journey through hardship, growth, and love. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more heartfelt, inspiring tales like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Your support helps us keep sharing stories of resilience, love, and transformation. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.